swear, the classic Tony Hawk games are like the ultimate uniting force in the gaming community. Whether you like Need for Speed or Forza, Halo, or any other FPS, or hell, even if you prefer EA's Skate, pretty much everyone can agree that Tony Hawk is awesome. Hell, even I was aware of this before I had even played a single game, mainly because I had somehow never heard of the PC ports at the time, nor had I figured out how emulation worked. As the title suggests, after finally trying out the three most significant releases of the original Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, I've grown to enjoy the N64 version most, which from what I've gathered seems to be a rather unpopular choice. Before I attempt to defend myself, I first want to make it clear that I will be looking at this game through a modern lens, since a lot of my points will pertain to how this game is experienced today, rather than pretending to still be in the year 2000. Contrary to my typical video structure, I'm starting this one with my main argument, and that is that in my opinion, the N64 version of Pro Skater has easily the best feeling controls of the three. The most common argument against this version's controls is the N64 controller itself, but as I said, this is a contemporary assessment, and as such, I'm going to be assuming that anyone playing this game today is doing so via an emulator with either a modern controller or, if you're like me, a keyboard. Obviously, this makes the button layout and physical attributes of the controller a complete non-issue, but since we're dealing with emulators here, this is pretty much a moot point. What I think the N64 version does remarkably better compared to the PS1 and Dreamcast version is the game feel. I'm not claiming the weight and responsiveness are perfect in any version of this game, as the sequels would tighten things up and feel significantly better regardless of the system you're playing on. But after numerous hours spent on the PS1 version, I just wasn't feeling it. Everything had this really clunky and sluggish sort of feel, and dare I say, the Dreamcast version somehow, despite running better, actually felt even heavier. I'm trying to be as open-minded as I can, you know, every time I'd boot up either of these two versions, I'd try my best to adapt, but it just wasn't happening. And the second I loaded up the N64 version, it's like the skateboard just got 50 pounds lighter. There's the occasional case of my spins not ending as soon as I want them to, but aside from that, I generally felt so much more in control that it actually allowed me to enjoy the game as an actual video game and not just a timepiece. While the controls and overall game feel were at the core of my argument, I've obviously got to address everything around it, and as far as the visuals go, there's pretty much no contest. I'm not necessarily calling the PS1 version ugly, but its texture warping and lack of Z-buffer really don't help the presentation, and as the earlier Tony Hawks always had a more down-to-earth approach to their art style, I feel the N64's superior, well, everything graphically, plus its trademark bilinear filtering, lends itself to that direction. On top of that, we've got nicer shadows, more defined rail sparks, and the skate letters have a slightly more pronounced glow. To address the elephant in the room, yes, the Dreamcast version looks best, but I've got my reasons that I'll get into later as to why that doesn't necessarily put it above the other two. And back to PS1, since we're dealing with emulation, it can look significantly better than it was supposed to, thanks to upscaling, texture filtering, and perspective correction. Despite this, I've got to be honest, it still doesn't look as good as the N64 version. You just can't take a 32-bit graphics engine, no matter how much you inject into it, and expect it to stack up to a 64-bit one, especially when it comes to 3D rendering. If I had to dig deep and find an aspect in which the N64 version is lacking on the visual front, I guess it would have to be the omission of the FMVs of skaters doing their thing and the occasional live band footage. These were a pretty novel concept when the game was new, you know, when you couldn't just look up skate videos or live shows, but as I'm gonna keep repeating throughout this video, the game is not new anymore, and you can just look up skate videos or performances of your favorite hardcore, prog rock, or ska punk bands. Moving on to sound, and this is where I will have to compromise and agree that the N64 version is at a disadvantage due to its usage of cartridges. Although the sound effects still sound just fine, not to mention the load times are drastically reduced thanks to the storage format, what most will point out to be the biggest problem is how the music had to be edited down to pieces in order to fit. This definitely can take away from the experience to an extent, but my counter argument is this. Is this an adequate defense? Well, if it were still the year 2000, probably not, but it's now over 20 years later, and if you're playing this game on an emulator, which you are far more likely to, then there's really no reason to rely on what's built into the game. To tie this whole thing together, My last point in defense of the N64 version is accessibility, or more specifically, its quality in relation to its system requirements. If you're not aware, emulation is the kind of thing where a game's system requirements are essentially doubled or tripled depending on when the system came out. For example, if your PC can run ports of 7th gen games no problem, that doesn't necessarily mean it'll run RPCS3 flawlessly. This isn't just down to the fact that 7th gen emulation is significantly younger and therefore less refined than 5th or 6th gen emulation, unless you're talking about Nintendo systems, but also it's to do with the very foundation of how emulation works. What does this have to do with Tony Hawk on N64? Well, this whole section is essentially why I wouldn't recommend the Dreamcast version, you know, aside from the sluggish controls, obviously. Yes, it looks nice, but in order to make that happen, especially at a modern display's native resolution, you're gonna need at least a mid-range graphics card of the last 5 to 7 years, compared to the other two versions that'll pretty much run at any resolution on any hardware developed in the last 15 years. I understand that higher than average system requirements are par for the course for emulation. I mean, why do you think most PS3 games, which is a system that came out in 2006, get benchmarked with Nvidia's latest tech? But this is 1999/2000 we're talking about. You seriously shouldn't need hardware that can run this to run this. Okay, let me calm down for a sec to put this whole rant into words that make sense. I recommend the N64 version of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater because it offers the most responsive controls, faster load times, in my opinion, more appealing and more scalable visuals, while also not using up 3.5 gigabytes of VRAM to run at 1080p. So I'm aware my video topics have been a little all over the place as of late, but I just find these kind of videos far more enjoyable to write compared to your typical reviews of a singular game. Although that's not to say I'd never make any more of those, since that would just make me a hypocrite, now wouldn't it? I really hope this whole defense type argument didn't come off as too aggressive, especially if you grew up with the PS1 version. I mean, Tony Hawk is still a classic, and its core gameplay holds up. I just felt that I wanted to express my preference for this particular release and why it's my go-to for revisiting the game. Thank you so much for sticking with me here, and also for the incredible support you've given me on my last 2 videos. Now, unfortunately, this might be my last video for a while, seeing as my last year of university is starting soon, and while the assignments we get aren't particularly difficult, there's still a lot of them, and it just eats up a majority of my time. I hope I still get the chance to make some more stuff during the few breaks we get, assuming you've got any video ideas at that point, and I'll see you guys then.